Yes, I can see the starting panel.
Does that go to the next slide? Fine.
Yeah, but the margins are too small, so we can see just maybe.
Okay, I see. So it's not actually presenting in the window. I'm not really sure how it's sharing. Let me stop this. Where I'll go is Finder. I'm going to see. Okay. If I just do it as the entire screen share. Is that presenting as the whole PowerPoint?
Okay. Yeah, that's correct. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Right. 2 moments. So first of all, thank you for the presentation. And I'd also just like to thank everyone for attending the session today. I'm going to be looking at winter and old age in 3 Odes of Horace, all from the first book of his collection. I'm going to be discussing how he uses it as a language to discuss and express his perception of old age. Winter and nature more generally are universally understood languages, which make them wonderful tools in works of literature that Horace profits from as much as he can. Nature is seldom used by the poet himself to describe nature, and instead it frequently acts as a metaphor or provides imagery to compare the natural world to the human, with varying intentions and messages. So the theme of winter as a point of reference for old age stems from the well-founded comparison of man's ages of life to nature's seasons. One of the earliest examples of this we can see in literature is in Homer's Iliad, in book 6, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, where Glaucus on the battlefield responds to Diomedes' question concerning his lineage, as to avoid breaking any alliances that have been previously formed before they engage in battle. In this speech, he states that when the season of spring has come, so of men, one generation springs up and another passes away. Here, Homer establishes the continuous cycle of humanity alongside the continuous seasonal cycle. But the seasons themselves aren't the focus, and they aren't exactly specifically divided and assigned a stage of life yet. We do, however, see this begin to emerge in a fragment of Mananus, which is quite a negative perception. But I have the first 10 lines of fragment 2 here, and we can see that most likely with the same Glaucus simile in mind from Homer, Mananus draws upon the concept of seasons as ages of man, and he laments spring ending, writing that when the end of this season passes by, that is spring, straightway death is better than life. This gives the rather morbid opinion or morbid understanding that once the happy season of youth, death is actually preferable to living on to the next one of autumn and winter, and therefore old age. So we can see here quite like a negative understanding of winter as a reader of old age. And when we turn to the Roman tradition, this continues. So looking at Ovid's Metamorphoses in book 15, he offers a clear example of the negative portrayal of winter and age. And this comes from the passage where, through the voice of Pythagoras, Ovid explicitly discusses the stages of man's life in terms of the seasons, writing here that trembling winter then came with faltering steps, its hair despoiled, or what of it has turned white. So conjures a rather pitiful image of old age as a time of weakness and frailty, and winter is clearly shown to be less than desirable. In this passage here, it is preceded by presentations of, summer, spring, and autumn also. And it's one of the few examples where winter is used as an explicit allusion to old age. However, as recognized by Pierre-Jacques Deron in his 1993 work, Hiems Latina, winter in Roman literature is more often alluded to in presentations of old age by using traits of winter to add to the descriptions of elderly. This tends to be through shared aspects of coldness, the color white, and trembling. An example of this is in Virgil's Aeneid in book 8, where Evander, states that it's the It's the Gelug cyclist. It's the frost of his old age that restricts him from taking a command. So here we see the slowness of the elderly kind of associated with the iciness and frost of winter, which links, the shared elements of reduced mobility. So with winter's more taxing elements being drawn upon, many have come to the conclusion that the literary view of old age in antiquity was a completely negative one, with Cocaine in her 2003 study on old age stating that in ancient Rome, old age was understood and characterized by physical decay, decrepitude, lack of strength, slowness of movement, trembling of limbs and voice, and loss of libido. She also states in the study that in literature, particularly, this state was feared. So when we come to Horace, this conclusion has often been shared, and many have agreed that through winter imagery and language, Horace shows that old age for him represents only a prelude to death and the loss of youthful enjoyment. However, I disagree with this. I'd like to show today, to some of you at least as much as I can, that at the very least, Horace presents old age impartially and at the most positively, as he sets forth his perception as something not to be lamented, but rather appreciated and made the most of. So unfortunately, today I don't have the time to go through an analysis of every single poem, but this kind of table gives you a brief overview of how they're formed and how his presentation comes through. It is a really oversimplified table. It's kind of just helpful as a visual aid, but so I've included here kind of the odes where clear allusions to elements of the old age are present, but I think we need to make sure that we understand that themes of some of these are also present in others, such as I've put mental turmoil that's not present in 1.4, but definitely themes and kind of elements that do allude to it throughout. It's just not as explicit as we find in the Socrates ode and the Carpe Diem ode. So when I'm talking about the physical condition, I'm tend to be referring to the physical discomforts that are kind of characterized as elderly ones. So frailty, again, white hair as just a kind of a physical manifestation of old age, and the loss of libido, or just strength in itself. Physical pleasures or benefits of winter and old age tend to be the opportunity for rest, which tends to be placed in the terms of retreat in the home, the warmth of the home. The fire is a big focus of Horace in discussion of old age, and also the symposium and having access to wine and good company. Fears and concerns come under mental turmoil. So this is the more generalized, obviously, fear of aging that was held by quite a few in antiquity. But what I'd like to focus on is the fear of death. As as we go further in our life, we tend to view it as we're kind of traveling down this path and approaching death. So Horace deals with those fears of death, and he also offers methods of soothing them. So in this kind of framework, we do see a pattern of Horace recognizing winter and old age's difficulties, but he does make explicit their solutions and at least try and deal with them. So they're identified by the poet, but they are specially dealt with. In my attempt to find a positive message in Horace's winter imagery, some key points have arisen. So that is, 1, the comparison of winter to spring has led it to be unfairly judged. 2, that winter is in fact not equated with death, as has previously kind of been assumed. And 3, that the winter storm does in fact represent the aged mind's troubles, or more specifically, the fears concerning death and the approach of death. So I'm going to try and go through these nuances in a little bit more detail while looking at the odes themselves. As we are on a time limit, I might not have time to get through them all, but we'll just kind of see how we go. So the first ode we'll look at is, and the first point is the comparison of winter to spring, leading it to be unfairly judged. And we're going to look at that in terms of ode 1.4. So in defense of winter, we can see that many have viewed the opening line of ode 1.4 as kind of the key to its interpretation, as it does present this clear dichotomy between the two seasons of winter and spring. And they've kind of taken it as confirmation that winter equally equates negative characteristics and spring positive ones. This tends to hinge upon the first word, solviter, which Solwo does directly translate to it is loosened here, but it does have quite strong associations with the idea of unchaining, unbinding, kind of the freeing. So this has unsurprisingly led to the conclusion that winter is a time of restriction and incarceration and bondage, as opposed to the liberation of spring. I mean, it's understandable when we look at this line, Horace does call it harsh winter, and spring comes with pleasing change. But when we go through the poem and kind of go beyond this first line, the interpretation kind of loses ground. So, in fact, themes of restriction and bondage are present in Springtime too, and in fact throughout this poem, as the idea of what is right and fitting becomes an element of all stages of life. So I've highlighted a few, but not all examples of this, with the use of traho rather than deduco of the keel. So deduco would be expected as the typical word, but traho kind of has the idea of reluctance. Some have noted that it brings the idea of ropes, and bondage kind of comes with all of that. The nymphs and the graces are linked in their dance, but they also could be implied to be kind of joined or yoked. And it's fitting for us to bind our heads with this myrtle, just as it's fitting to kind of bow to Faunus's demands and give him the sacrifice of whatever he'd like. So in this way, we can kind of see how themes of restriction and bondage are found throughout the poem, and note that Horace, in fact, is alluding to the fixed nature of the human life cycle and the fact that it must be followed, and that in every season we kind of have these elements that we're obligated to fill. Just as we can't hold on for winter too long, and we have to let it go appropriately when we reach death. So returning back to Solwater, we can see it as an indication that winter should not exist beyond its limit, and that the change is welcome because perhaps it has been held on. That's to say, we have to accept death and this natural cycle, which kind of foreshadows the whole Ode's key messages. So moving on to our next point, winter is not equated with death. Winter in interpretations of these three odes particularly, well, more particularly in 1.9 and 1.4, has been judged as a time of aging and death. Arkins, in a 1993 essay, argues that winter, with its attendant colour of grey and white, is a time not for love, but for death, or the contemplation of death. So I'd like to show that although winter may provoke thoughts of life's end, the season itself is not equated to it, and it is in fact the ending of winter which represents death, not the season itself. So we're going to return to 1.4 here, but jump ahead to line 13 and the entrance of death with pallid and moors. This is obviously quite a common epithet for death, and is quite rightly mostly translated as just pale death. But this assertion of death's paleness has been read by some, such as Woodman here, as an indication that Horace is associating it with winter's whiteness. With this, I disagree. I think that we have to understand that obviously pallor acts as an indication of death's dullness and pallor, but I'd like to highlight the fact that it implies the absence of colour itself, with us only having to consider its alternate translations, which we can find easily in Oxford Latin Dictionary, of colourless. And I think that this idea of, death as a kind of a colourless time is strengthened and highlighted by Horace in the emphasis he places on the deficiency and deprivation of the underworld, which we can see highlighted a bit later, where, it's the poor home of Pluto, especially when that contrasts with the addressee's richness, and the fact that he kind of describes it in this negative formulation of what will not be there. So the absence of colour in death contrasts with the depiction of winter's vivid white in line 4, where the pigment of the now past winter is emphasized. I've given it here. We have 3 different words denoting the whiteness. Carnice in itself does tend to need a verb to kind of highlight its whiteness, but I think that when we even consider the word plata, meaning meadows, this contrast even brings out the whiteness, because it immediately kind of produces the image of a blooming green field, especially to contemporary readers, as it was indeed used by Horace and his peers in descriptions of kind of luscious verdant fields and fertility. So with Neck opening this line, he's able to kind of express the image of a green meadow, which is, covered by this added whiteness. It's definitely very much added during winter, but then it becomes green again as it melts away. So we see that as the winter season ends, its whiteness dissipates too, and therefore the disappearance of color, which is provoked by this ending, is denoting death, not winter's white itself. So the final point that I have, hopefully I can get through this quickly, is the idea of the winter storm to represent the troubles of the aged mind. And we have winter storms present in 2 odes of the odes that we're looking at today. I just want to check how long I have left. There we go. So in 1.9, the Socrates ode, we have a winter storm in stanza 3. This has often been a topic of disagreement as it provides a contrast from the opening kind of serene winter scene. And it has led to quite a few complaints against the poem's unity. However, I believe that as this opening stanza we have is quite a tangible image, it's in fact, you know, the intangibility of stanza 3 that we have to focus on. West, in his commentary, recognizes that the verb tense is here, the perfect tense being used in the adverbial clause and the present tense in the principle, which I've highlighted, shows that we're beginning a general law. And I think that also we have to understand that he's giving us this in a kind of rhetoric, not rhetoric, poetic kind of version of praeterito. You know, leave the rest of the gods who, as soon as they lay low the battling winds on the fervid sea, no longer will the cypress trees or the old ash shake. So he's describing this scene as it ceases to exist, which adds to its abstract nature. The linking of the storm to thoughts of death emerges through analysis of meanings and associations. Most notably here is Horace's fear for the sea, which in his poetry is most often negatively characterized, as well as the meanings and associations with the trees. So the cypress trees, cupressi, have often been used in terms of funerals and have quite a few funeral associations. And I also do think it's notable that it's one of the only trees which Horace describes in negative terms in his collection of odes, particularly in 2.14 in an ode to Posthumus, he calls them invisas cupressi. So here we have kind of this idea of thoughts of death in terms of the sea in quite a metaphorical way, but if we turn to 1.11, we see it come through more patently. So Rudd considers this conclusion that I've come to for 1.9 in terms of 1.11. He doesn't tend to go into it much further in a paper on the patterns of Horatian lyric, but we are made patently aware that the addressee of this poem has thoughts occupied by death, as she's quite literally bid not to think of them and not to ask them in the first line here. So we know that the poem has a winter setting given in line 4, and this kind of implies the age of the addressee as maybe more elderly. And it's now in this moment as she's asking about her future and, you know, thinking of death that the storm is waging and kind of tearing down. So we can see that the advice for this is simply to just be wise. We must just drink our wine, the same as in 1.9 as we saw. We have the similar idea of not asking of the future, quid sit futurem cras fugere quaerere, is repeated in Ode 1.11, but we're given the famous carpe diem. So I think that we can see that as long as we're wise and we focus on what we can, we leave to the gods what we have out of our control and focus on the physical aspects which can soothe our physical discomfort, old age can be enjoyable as long as we leave what we must in the hands of the gods. So just to close and return to my opening words on nature as universal language, we can see that although not all of those reading Horace's poetry will have reached an older age, through winter he is able to express and relate his perception of it in identifiable terms. Thank you for listening, and I hope that was helpful to anyone.